Hey folks, it's Patriot Nurse, and in today's segment you are joining me for a brief crash course in the culture and history of the Appalachians. And a full disclaimer here, I am not a historian, I'm not a cultural anthropologist. I didn't waste about 6 figures worth of time to have a piece of paper that really doesn't have any functional value. So instead of espousing my particular accolades for talking about the history, I'll just give you the background. From someone whose family's been here a while. I am, depending on how you count it, between 11th and 12th generation in the Southern Appalachians. And what I'm going to share with you today comes as a response to a question from one of my followers who asked after my last video on homesteading regarding cultural compatibility. He asked, can you tell us specifically about the history of the Appalachians? So the history of the Appalachians and the culture of the Appalachians I'm going to go over with y'all here for a minute, and this is particularly for Southern Appalachia. The Appalachians, of course, are a mountain chain that stretch way up clear into Maine, if I'm not mistaken. You know, clear all the way down to North Georgia, and I am focusing mostly for this one on the Southern Appalachians. Now, the first thing that you'll probably notice is the accent, and mine is actually pretty washed out, to be honest. College does that, actually, unfortunately. College does that, and it's unfortunate that it is that way, that there's a stereotyping against our accent, but our accent comes as a direct consequence of the founding peoples who moved here, and that is the Scots-Irish. And so you'll find that people in the mountains tend to hold on to their R's more than the deep south, where the R's are a little bit more flat. I suck at deep south accents, so I'm apologizing for that one. But our R's tend to be harder, and we tend to have a little bit more of a fight in us, and there's a reason for this. Because the original peoples who came into the Southern Appalachians, East Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky as well, they came in direct defiance to the British Crown. And a lot of the people who came over here were the Scots-Irish. They were from Ulster, Northern Ireland, and they had been displaced. They were Scots who had been displaced. Sorry for the gnats, y'all. It is the mountains. They had been displaced, and they had a particular hatred and a vitriol in their hearts and their places for, in many cases, a strong central government or the British Crown. And so you'll find that the people of this area have a long and distinguished history of fighting. There's a reason why East Tennessee is called the volunteer state, and that is because, I believe it was the War of 1812, we sent more volunteers than anybody else to go and fight in the war. But we do have a long history of sending volunteers to fight. We love to fight. We are a scrapping people, and we have a sister state, of course, which is Texas, and a lot of East Tennesseans fought at the Alamo, at the Battle of the Alamo. So we have a history of fighting. We have a history of essentially living our lives by the mantra, leave me the hell alone. And that it is how it is. And I'm not saying this from a perspective of everybody should be this way or everybody should be scrapping like us, because when it comes right down to it, the United States is a conglomeration, is a patchwork quilt of many different types of people, different founding peoples, and the land itself contributes to a lot of the variance within peoples. And our anti-federalist fathers knew this, which is why they were so dedicated to the concept of local governance, and the limitations upon government, specifically a strong central government, because they recognize that, just like with the history of the people of Appalachia, that when strong central governments get in power, whether it's a monarchy or a consolidated, devolved form of a republic like in Rome, that it tends to oppress people, especially people in rural areas. And the people of the mountains have known this for a very long time. Specifically when it comes to the culture of the Appalachians, there is a lot of variance, actually, between the regions of Appalachia. Southern Appalachia, specifically with East Tennessee, West North Carolina, and also with Kentucky and parts of Southwest Virginia, they tend to have a lot more of the Southern flair because, honestly, of the allegiances during the war between the states, also known as the Civil War. Civil War was not a civil war. You did not have two factions or more warring for a central power control. We just wanted to be, in the words of Jefferson Davis, left alone. All we asked is to be let alone. And you see the cultural and the linguistic influence in the Southern Appalachians. You also do see that there is more of a focus on perhaps civilities and manners that may not necessarily be what you think. For instance, many people who resettle to the area, or they move to the area, they will find that there is an incongruity. They'll find that people will be very kind to their face, and then they'll talk about them like horrible behind their back. And that is perhaps not the most ideal ways of doing things, but it harkens back to a couple of major points. And the first is the gentility, the southern gentility that came as a result of a lot of English people settling the South, not the mountains, the South in general, the deep South. And that, of course, has its influence just regionally. But also, the Scots-Irish have a long history of being a warring and scrapping people. And if you come from how shall I say this? If you come from a group of people who are ready to throw down at any given minute, you tend to be civil to the face and maybe not so much behind the back. Again, I'm not saying that that's an ideal way of doing things, but that is one of the traits of the region. And so you see this a lot from people who have relocated. They'll say, gosh, these people, it's very cliquish and it's very tribal, and you're darn right. And the people of the mountains specifically have a long history of being very tribal and very skeptical, if not hostile, to outsiders, because specifically in the mountains in southern Appalachia, after the war between the states, the federal government, under the banner of Reconstruction, subsidized a lot of cronyism and nepotism and rewarded scallywags around here. And what are scallywags? They were essentially people who ratted out their neighbors for union support, for federal government support, and they were rewarded at the end of the event. If you've ever seen Gone with the Wind, the classic example of a scallywag would be the overseer, right, who was rewarded after the fact, and the history of the carpetbagger. But that does influence a lot of the people of the region here. And the war between the states, the Civil War, had a heavy influence upon the culture of the southern Appalachians specifically because we were so heavily divided. The East Tennessee region was more Union in its support than Middle and West Tennessee, but by no means was it a rubber stamp monolithic support. With my family, for instance, you have heavy division back on the line. I have a cavalry officer who was my fourth great-grandfather, and then on the other side of the equation, I have Union support. So on one branch of my family line, you see that is the case. And the mistrust, the division, it had a direct impact on the way in which people related to each other after the war between the states, leading right up to the Hatfields and the McCoys, which is, if you study it, it's a long and complicated thing, but a lot of the hostility started out with land disputes that came as a direct consequence of Confederate versus Unionist support from the war between the states. And so this region was very heavily impacted by it. And also you see that the region itself, specifically with southern Appalachia, and it is Appalachia, not Appalachian, it's Appalachia. The region itself has been very sheltered and very closed off just due to the geography from the west of the country. And it's for that reason that we retain our accents. And our accents are old. In fact, a lot of the vernacular that we use is old. For instance, if you see something that's nasty and rotted on the side of the road, it's not uncommon to hear, good Lord, that's Kiarny nasty. Kiarny, to call it Kiarny, which can come from carrion, but it can also come from, I believe it's the Gaelic word cairn, which is a pile of rocks over a grave. So the word Kiarny coming from a reference to a grave or decaying, rotting flesh. It's kind of interesting just to see as an example of that. You also see that in the vernacular, I'm a-goin'. There's an A prefix before the verb. I'm a-goin' to get that. I'm a-fixin' to, and that is a remnant, to my knowledge, it's a remnant of the specific dialect of Gaelic that was brought over here. The A prefix, the A prefix. I'm a-goin', I'm a-fixin', and I'm a-goin'. That is a remnant. But as far as the practicalities of people moving here, I'm just going to give you all a warning, okay? And you can think what you want to think. I'm not trying to offend anybody. I'm just going to tell you the truth. If you are even from the county over, you will be viewed in many cases moving to the hills as an outsider. The people from the county over are viewed as outsiders. So you can imagine what people relocating from different parts of the country are going to be viewed as. And I have heard people say, I moved down here and everything's been fine, or I moved down here and I've been accepted. That I don't claim to be all-knowing, but I'm here to tell you, if you're expecting that what you're seeing is going to be the case, then you're going to be mistaken. Because a lot of times people will put up a good front just to be polite, but they really, in many cases, are extremely hostile of outsiders. And you have to understand that specifically in the southern mountainous regions, the southern Appalachians, there's a long history of people coming into areas, getting control of the land, consolidating power, lining up with either the federal government or lining up with coal companies specifically, and also lumber, to extract wealth out of the mountains and to hang the local people out to dry in many different cases. So there is a well-developed history of hostility towards outsiders, and you got to understand that. And I've talked about this in the past. If you're going to relocate, cultural compatibility is a big thing. And I've seen this with people who move into the areas. They have this idea that when they relocate, that things need to be fixed, that these people, these savages, need to be acculturized. They need to be brought into the 21st century, or whatever the case may be. And the thing is, y'all, the reason why we are the way we are, why our culture has remained intact in many cases, is because we have essentially eschewed the influence of the outside world. We don't care for it. We don't want it. We don't want outside involvement. We don't want people coming in and tell us what to do. And that, again, goes back to the Scots-Irish and who founded this country. And y'all have to remember, if you're a good, solid American patriot, the Anti-Federalists were very much in support of this ideology of local peoples being sovereign, that the consent of the government was derived, or the government was derived from the consent of the governed, that the local peoples were the best ones suited to make decisions for them, not people 200, 300, 400 miles away in some central capital city. They were very, very much in support of this idea of local people being able to govern themselves, because they did not, historically, they knew that in a landmass this expansive with people who make their living from completely different things, for instance, people in West Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of East Tennessee, coal and lumber are big here. We're not going to have the same interest as somebody in New York City or in Chicago or in LA. We have differences among us. And so for that reason, the Anti-Federalists were very much sticklers for the Electoral College and for empowering the states versus the central government. And it's for, that reason that we have endured, I think, as a nation. But specifically with the Appalachian culture, these are just some of the things that I wanted to cover with people. And I have just scratched the surface here, y'all. There's a really good documentary called The Appalachians, which I'll put a link to in the description box below. And it's a good crash course in general. There's so much history in the mountains. There's a wealth of history. But the core take-home point here is that the people of the hills, the people of the mountains, want to be left the hell alone. We do not like either federal government involvement or outside involvement from people who are not from the area. We tend to be very, very tribalistic, very protective of our people, of our culture. And that, I think, is a good thing overall, because as the nation is getting washed out and homogenized and people are being told to forget their history, the people of the hills are very much doubling down on it, to my knowledge, at least from what I'm seeing here. And as the seventh great-granddaughter of Colonel Adam Alexander, one of the signers of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence in Mecklenburg, North Carolina, I feel it's very important to carry that legacy of self-sufficiency and of independence. This area, the Southern Appalachians, is rich in history, especially with the Battle of Kings Mountain. We're rich in history of people who are fierce defenders to the death of liberty. And that is the legacy, I think, that the Appalachians bring forward into the future. When the rest of the country is going absolutely haywire and absolutely nuts, those of us here who have deep roots here, we're going to hold fast to it. That's who we are, and that's who I want to be. That's the crash course in the culture of the Appalachians. I hope it was helpful for y'all. If you enjoyed the video today, you can subscribe to me. You can also make sure, if you are subscribed on YouTube, click the little bell button down there, okay, at the bottom of under the screen, because some people are not getting the notifications as to when I make videos. You can also support me on Patreon. If you go over there, I got a link in the description box below. I got different tiers here. You can actually request videos and I'll make them. But there are different tiers there. You can check it out there at the website. Again, I hope it was helpful for y'all. I hope you have a great weekend, and thanks for joining me here in the mountains for a crash course on the Appalachians. Have a wonderful weekend, y'all. For now, it's Patriot Nurse signing off, and I'll see y'all later. Bye.